Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion called To Go Public or To Not Go Public behind the whistleblower's personal decision process. My name is Delphine Halgand-Mishra, and I'm the Executive Director of the Signals Network, an American nonprofit organization that supports whistleblowers who have shared major public interest information with the press. We are especially focusing on tech whistleblowers at the Signals Network. We create resources like the Tech Worker Handbook that are good resources for your sources, journalists, but we protect whistleblowers who have shared information about nuclear safety, medical device, corruption, and so on. We have special links with journalists because most of the whistleblowers we protect are sent to us by journalists. And really, we see the protection of the whistleblowers in three big moments: the protection before publication of the revelation, at the moment of the publication of the revelation, and the after, which are most of the time very intense for the whistleblowers. So you can imagine how passionate I am by the topic we are here to discuss today, and how lucky I feel to be here with you all: Annika Collier-Navaroli, Antoine Deltour, Mark McGann, and Frédéric Obermeyer. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming here today to discuss with us. And I will start with you, Annika. And I think you have a very interesting journey to tell us. You're a lawyer, and then you went to Columbia Journalism School. Yes. And at Columbia, actually your master's thesis was titled "The Revolution Will Be Tweeted." So not a big surprise that a few years later, you ended up at Twitter in the trust and safety team, where you were the most senior, really, member of the US safety policy team. You decided to testify anonymously to the US Congress committee that was investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And really, you testified to the committee about the warnings you and others at Twitter were sharing with the Twitter management about the risk of violence from President Trump tweets. And a few months after you testified anonymously, you decided that you needed to say who you were. Who was the person who gave this important information to the US Congress? And you gave an exclusive interview to the Washington Post to say who you were. So, full disclosure, that's kind of when we met. And since then, our legal director, Jennifer Gibson, that you should all know at the end of this panel, became and act as your lawyer and worked with you to prep you for Congress hearings and so on. But I really want to go back to the topic of today and your decision. Why did you decide to say that you were the whistleblowers? And what did you want to achieve? And what would you like the journalists here to know about this?
Yeah, is this on? Hey y'all, this is very loud. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Delphine, and for asking that. And yes, when I first came forward, I was anonymous. And my decision to come forward and reveal my identity was incredibly complicated. Being anonymous provided me this sort of level of safety because nobody really knew who I was, right? And so I was talking about, some of the most powerful companies and the most powerful people in the world, and it was incredibly dangerous for my safety. And even though I was safe in one way, I realized as soon as I came forward, my voice was disguised and I had like a kind of caricature that I was hidden behind. And there were so many assumptions that were made about who I was. And the Associated Press reported that I was a man. And so other papers started picking it up, and I realized that people assume that, the only person who could be working in a tech company and possibly be dealing with policy that had to deal with Donald Trump was a straight white man. And unfortunately, that's not who I am. And so I realized that while my anonymity provided safety, it also didn't allow for my existence as a Black queer woman to be around. And so I realized it was important for me and for the next generation of people who look like me and who love like me to realize that we exist and that we have always existed and that we belong in these rooms of power. And so I decided to reveal my identity for that. And for other reasons, I will also say, I didn't know until my voice was played on C-SPAN how unique my talking pattern is, right? I have this, distinct intonation. One of my friends, I was like, "Does that what I sound like?" And they were like, "Yeah, when you really get into your gig, like that's how you flow." And so I realized that people knew who I was, right? And so as soon as it came forward, I was getting these text messages of like, "Hey, friend, haven't heard from you in a while. How are you doing?" Right? So it became very clear to me that my choices were either to self-disclose on my own time and, tell my own narrative, or to wait to be doxxed, honestly. And so for all of those reasons, I decided to come forward and share my name. And the last thing I will say, as journalists know, there's power in putting your name and your face behind things, right? Anonymity is great and it is safe, and it only goes so far.
And what did you wish to achieve, and what do you wish you would have known then?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I decided to do this, I sat down and I wrote a list of all of my goals, which I would highly recommend if anybody wants to whistleblow. Write down those goals. And I've gone back to them a couple of times, and the number one thing on my list was just to get the truth on the record. And I realized how important it was for history and for the world to understand, what happened within Twitter during the Trump era, and how these decisions were made or not made. I wanted that to be known. I also realized the threat that was at hand for me. I went and worked at another tech company, Twitch, after I worked at Twitter, and I saw the exact same problems. And I realized, oh, this is going to happen again. And by this, I mean January 6th, political violence, right? And so it was really important for me to warn people in power to say, we have to make some changes. And if we don't, this thing is going to happen again. And it did. So January 8th, 2023, in Brazil, just like a playbook, we saw it happening again. And so I want to continue to, say, like, if we don't get social media under control, if we don't understand and rein in content moderation systems, political violence is going to continue to happen all over the world. Our democracies are at stake. I've said the very societal fabric of our planet, and I really mean that, is at stake here. And so, what was your last question?
I think I will ask it to the three of you, so maybe you can, it was, what did you wish you would have known then? But I might turn to Mark, and thank you, Annika. So Mark, I will turn to you now, and really go back to say that you spent your whole career as a senior executive working for telecommunication companies, financial service companies, and tech companies. And at Uber, you were a top executive, really leading the efforts to win over governments across Europe, Africa, and you were working at Uber from 2014 to 2016. And you decided to share 124,000 companies' documents with The Guardian, who then shared them with 40 media of partners of ICIJ. And these documents really exposed how Uber forced its way into markets in violation of existing laws, And as you said in the Guardian interview, when you made yourself known as the Uber Files whistleblower, you said that really this document exposed a system that sold people a lie. And we worked together since the publication of the Uber Files, since July 2022. And same again, for full disclosure, our legal director, Jennifer, is acting as one of your lawyers since then. And you have been busy since then, very busy. You testified at the EU Parliament, you testify at the Dutch Parliament, you testify at the Belgian Parliament, at the French Parliament, and many others contribution to the public conversation. And really, I also want to go back to you with the same question about your own personal decision process of why did you decide to share and to be known as the person who shared these documents?
So, good question. So I was essentially in charge of most of Uber's activities in more than almost 50 countries across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And when you're inside the company and you're working 18 hours a day, you sort of don't have a lot of perspective. I resigned a few times, but ultimately because it was dangerous for me and my family. You know, I had bodyguard protection 24/7, because at the time, in particular in Europe, Uber was forcing its way into the market, saying, well, your laws are bad laws, so we're just going to put them out of the way, and we're going to show you how great our business model is. And years later, I think a lot of people in this room will understand me when I say that during the pandemic in particular, a lot of us had time to just sit and think and reflect over a lot of things. And you know, for almost 30 years, I've been at the nexus between business and government, you know, constantly in these meetings where I'm pinching myself, thinking I'm on the other side of the table to this minister, this commissioner, this president, etc., and trying to advocate for good rules, sensible legislation, pro-consumer, pro-competition, etc. But I actually realized that if you talk to any Uber driver, and here in Italy, the way Uber Eats delivery people are treated is just, it's not just indecent, it's immoral, but it's legal. And when I realized that we had sold a lie, you know, we're saying 3 different things to 3 different audiences. We're saying to the investors who were throwing money at us in, okay, 0 interest rates at the time, so free money to buy your way into market. We were saying to investors, invest with us, you make huge returns in a short period of time. We're saying to consumers, this is the best way to get around your city. Amazing rides, cheaper than any cab fare, cheaper than any other way, because we were massively subsidizing, buying our way into the market. And we were saying to drivers, sign up with Uber and you will have an amazing job prospect, amazing economic opportunities. And now there are 28 million people just in Europe alone who don't have basic social protections. They don't have basic human rights. And governments just stood by and either allowed this to happen or were actually complicit. But going back to, you know, when I was looking at what we were doing, and I realized that it wasn't about Uber. This wasn't to blow the whistle on Uber and cause problems for the company or for founders or whatever. It's systemic. Time and time again, very wealthy companies come into markets and the governments just don't have the ability to sit down with them and try and have a proportionate, fair, non-discriminatory treatment of those companies. You know, Google set up the meetings, my initial meetings with Emmanuel Macron. You know, so we were getting billions of dollars, but also the Rolodex of Google, the Rolodex of people who were best friends with David Cameron, with Matteo Renzi, etc. So it was just, I realized that, you know, on 24th of February last year, I realized that the unthinkable had happened. We again had war in Europe. And I'm not a soldier, I'm not a fighter. And I realized that, and it's really altruism that drives you to be a whistleblower, because it's a very, very lonely existence, as Annika and Antoine know. But I realized that we can talk about threats to our way of life and threats to democracy coming from autocrats like Vladimir Putin, but it's actually the flaws, the serious flaws in our own democracies that allow companies to buy access to markets, buy their way into the corridors of power. And ultimately, it's an abuse of the process, and it's abuse, weakening of our democratic systems. So I decided that no one else around me was coming forward with what they had witnessed. The process is another story, which I'm happy to talk about, but it really comes down to altruism. And especially, I was the one in the room. You know, I helped sell a lie. And I guess it's the way my parents brought me up, that at some point you realize, I can't live with this. Talking to Uber drivers, knowing how much they really take home at the end of the day, at the end of the month, seeing how undocumented immigrants are put onto the Uber Eats platform, and then when regulators found out, they're just ejected and treated as irrelevant. So I was in a unique position to say to those who wanted to listen, this is going on. Corruption is shape-shifting. It just goes on. And you know, as Keelan Gallagher said earlier this morning, it's kind of like whack-a-mole, but if people like me don't find the courage, and I'm not sure if it's bravery or stupidity, but don't find the courage to say, look, this cannot happen. It shouldn't happen. We need to sit down and regulate properly for transparent lobbying and for proper treatment of workers. Then I think we're headed to the wall.
To say that you, Mark, and Annika, I heard you both saying the same thing. I was waiting for someone else to speak up. You were waiting for someone else, and nobody did. So then you spoke up.
Yes. Hey, yes. I remember sitting there saying, like, somebody needs to say something, somebody needs to do something, and then realizing, oh, that somebody is me.
Yeah, and it's marked me because you both really repeated the same sentences. Thank you, Mark. And now I want to turn to Antoine, who has also a pretty unique story and journey. And for those who don't know him yet, and again, for full disclosure, Antoine is on the board of the Signals Network and has been since the beginning. So thank you for helping us build this organization. But you're mostly known now for being the one who shook the whole country of Luxembourg and their whole system of tax avoidance. So basically, at 22, you were hired as an auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC, and quickly you realized how so many international companies have a Luxembourg entity to avoid paying a lot of taxes. Basically, you really discover how these so-called tax rulings work. And so you left your job pretty quickly, but before that, you copied a lot of documents. And you were contacted then by a French journalist, and you decided to share these documents with this journalist who was working for a prominent TV investigation show. That show was broadcasted in 2012. PwC was very mad, and they started a manhunt and figure out who you were pretty quickly. But the investigation took some time, so 2 years later, that's when your house was searched. At the same time, coincidentally, ICIJ published a much larger investigation, so-called LuxLeaks. And it's really then at this moment that you were detained, questioned, charged, and facing a long time in jail. And that's when you decided to say publicly that you were the whistleblowers behind the LuxLeaks. Can you tell us again how this decision process was for you, and what did you wish you would have known then, or what did you learn along this journey?
The LuxLeaks was described by the Luxembourg government as the worst attack against Luxembourg since the Second World War, and that's why Luxembourg authorities, together with PwC, combined their legal forces to fight back, not against tax avoidance in Luxembourg, but against the two whistleblowers, Raphaël Allais and me, and the journalist Édouard Perrin. So my name would have been disclosed anyway during the court case, but before this, my lawyers offered me two options. The first one was a low-profile option, which consisted in saying, okay, I recognize that what I did, I regret it, and I will never do it again, I apologize. And the second option was to publicly take responsibility for what I did and to explain myself. So I've chosen the second option, but I think that the best option for a whistleblower is to keep anonymous. I really think this, because it's the only way to have no impact on your life. But in this case, I didn't have this choice anymore. So I've taken the decision to go public with, I would say, four main reasons. The first is that it's very difficult to keep a secret for a long life time. I didn't manage to do it myself during the period between 2012, the TV show, and 2014, when I went forward, because when you drink beers with a friend, it's very easy to tell what you have deeply inside you, and so I can imagine how it must be difficult for someone like John Doe from the Panama Papers to keep such a secret so long. A second reason is that going public helps you taking part in spreading the word, in making sure that the public shares your concern. It's what is the most important for a whistleblower. It's not your personal role, but to make sure that the public shares your concerns. You're really deeply convinced that something is wrong, and you want people to know about it. And if you go public, then you take part in it, and you can you have hundreds of opportunities to speak during conferences, interviews, etc. And it's really good. And a third reason is that it gives you the strength to defend yourself. If you keep anonymous and you are a victim of retaliation, you are just enduring the events. But when you go public, then you are active. And in my case, it was a way to create a support committee, to have a petition with lots of people saying, okay, it's unjust that we charge the whistleblower, and nothing of this would have happened without going public. But the other reason for going public, maybe it's not a reason to go public, but something to have into consideration, is that you will lose some personal and professional contacts, and you have to be ready to change of job. So in my case, it was a previous decision. I had decided to resign, but in many cases, it's not a choice, and the whistleblower has to be ready to change of job.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that you still think that anonymity is the best option, because you are the best case that I know of a whistleblower who succeeded to reinvent its professional life and to have a normal life, because you were able to switch jobs before you became known as a whistleblower. And I really use your example a lot when we speak to people who are doing it, of thinking of replanning your professional life in advance before they could be made public, because it's much more complicated after. And it's time to turn to you, Frédéric. So, of course, you don't need a big introduction, so I will not list all the investigation you worked on, but you worked with many whistleblowers in your career, and we worked with some together. And actually, the main whistleblowers we can think of is John Doe, the whistleblower behind the Panama Papers. So John Doe is not here to tell us how it was to work with you, but it is a very fascinating relationship that you established with the source. And I find it pretty interesting that a few years after the big Panama Papers revelation, you had the opportunity to interview again John Doe, I think it was last year, and you were saying how it was, you were grateful and relieved to have this opportunity. So I just want to hear, I'm curious to hear your perspective as a journalist about the decision of the sources, the whistleblower you work with.
Well, first of all, I would say, and pick up where Antoine, what Antoine said, if you would ask me, I would always recommend a whistleblower to stay anonymous, because I think that's like the first professional thing that comes to your mind, because we have seen so many whistleblowers either ending up in prison, facing losing a job, losing their friends, family, and stuff like that. But I think that's only like the professional side, like, hey, that can keep you safe. But I think then there's also the human side, that every whistleblower is a human being. A journalist working with a whistleblower, that's a relationship. And I think it must be super difficult to see a revelation like the Panama Papers, or recently the Swiss secrets, or the Vulcan files, which were all based on sources and whistleblowers that are not known to the public. And you see the headlines, you see journalists giving interviews, sitting on panels, speaking about their revelations, and you know, hey, it's me. You're not able to tell your friends, because if you do so, you blow your cover. You're also not able to take in credit. And I think what John Doe, the source behind the whistleblower, the Panama Papers did, was in that respect very clever, because John Doe is not an anonymous. It's a figure. It's John Doe. We all know that John Doe. Every country has a John Doe. In German, it's Max Mustermann. But when you refer to the whistleblower has a name, so we can all give credit. We can speak here about John Doe. I can tell the public like that we all owe John Doe, that governments around the world owe John Doe, and I think that helped. And John Doe also like wanted to explain what he or she did. That's why after the Panama Papers we received a kind of manifesto, and we discussed it a lot if we should publish it. Because that's a short line to walk here. And we in the end came to the conclusion that we owe it to the whistleblower, and that is also a way of protecting the whistleblower, because if it were not us who worked with John Doe over a month, maybe he or she would have turned to another journalist and thereby like making a mistake, and then there could be a certain danger. And for us, for my colleague Bastian Obermeier and me, it was then very important to hear after 6 years after the publication that the person is still safe. Because, I mean, knowing what happened since then, I mean, at that point in time we spoke about the best friend of Vladimir Putin being in the data, oligarchs like Rottenberg, Usmanov, who are now all sanctioned. They're all in the data. And to hear that he or she has a good life in these days, that was a huge relief. And also that, I think, was what we owe to John Doe, to make his or her words public after such a long time, because otherwise he or she might be tempted, like after 10 years, to say like, hey, that's me. Maybe he or she is sitting in this audience, I don't know. So, but I think there is a way, and I think that's where we as journalists need to be more innovative. And I think where it's good to see like groups like the Signals Network bringing together expertise from a legal side, but also like from the experience of whistleblowers who have already blown the whistle. Because I think we need to find more ways of addressing both needs. Security, also like this human part of it, like, hey, I think you we all owe you that you get credit for what you have done. And I think there's ways how we can do that. And I think there's also something that, as I know that there's many journalists here in the room, that the journalists who are not part of a certain revelation, I think, have to keep in mind, because there's something that I observe in many projects. As soon as there's a revelation, the journalists who are not part of it try to find out who is behind it. Who is the woman, the man behind it? Because that's always an easy story. It's a hunt that's always so thrilling. But hey, let's stay calm. Is it really the story who leaked the Panama Papers? Is it really the story who leaked the Uber files? Or is the real story what is in there? And I think that's something where we as journalists have to learn our lessons, and I think we haven't done yet so far.
Thank you, Frédéric. And on that, I want to continue on that point of like, I think you all learned so much during your whistleblowing journey. Nobody knows what it is before doing it. Each journey is very unique. But I really want to take this opportunity that you're here today addressing the Perugia Festival attendees, which are mostly journalists. I would like you to share what you wish you would have known and what you wish journalists should think of when working with a whistleblower. Annika, you want to go first?
Yeah, I was shaking my head furiously when you mentioned security, because I think that's one of the biggest things that I would recommend that journalists think about, especially when speaking with whistleblowers. Everybody's safety and security concerns are different depending on what information they have and how they're sharing it and all of these things. And as you've heard, every one of us has explained, you know, we've lost friends, we've lost family, we've lost jobs, right? There is such a risk to doing this and to speaking with people. And I have been shocked sometimes by how little I felt some journalists took that into consideration. There were moments where I was like, oh my God, you are going to get me sued by the richest man on earth and also murdered, right? And that's not what I would like to do, especially not for somebody else to get an exclusive story, right? And so I would recommend that, you know, approaching whistleblowers as humans, right? The humanity that each and every one of us have, and, you know, maybe sometimes breaking your own rules, right? And understanding that the conversation might have to be a little bit different. You might have to gain trust, right? You mentioned I am trained as a journalist, right? And so these very basic things, I've been astonished by, you know, arrogance and the lack of trust building that individuals have approached me with, right? And so I would really recommend going back to the basics and realize you're speaking to a human who is risking you're not even sure what in order to share information. And I think the last thing I'll recommend is, you know, I said, write down those goals, right? Ask what the goals are. Because part of the reason why I have spoken with journalists is, does this align with the goals that I have written down? And how can I make sure that the story does that?
Yeah, very good point. And in the conversation we have with whistleblowers, there's 3 questions that I really often go back to is, what is your safety network? Always health, mental health, your safety, people. What do you want to achieve? And what will be your life after? And this question should be in the mind of whistleblowers, I think, from day -2. And so I completely agree. So Mark, what do you wish journalists could know more or think of when working with whistleblowers?
I mean, there's a lot of things I would have done differently, but I worked with a brilliant team at The Guardian, the investigations team run by Paul Lewis. But the very first conversation I had was with the former head of investigations, who's now head of news at The Guardian, Nick Hopkins. I knew I wanted to do this. And for 45 minutes almost, he didn't talk about Uber, didn't want to know what I thought I could reveal. It was about me, my mental health, my safety. Was I sure I wanted to do this? And now if I look back, I mean, there's a before and after. You cannot put the genie back in the bottle. You know, I achieved and did so much in my life and my career prior to July of last year, but forever, from now on and forever, I guess, I'll be just rubber stamped as the Uber whistleblower. I had the choice to remain anonymous, and I asked the journalists, Guardian, ICIJ, you know, does it help the story? Does it help impact if I'm revealed? If so, then fine. You know, I was privileged to be. I wasn't outed. You know, I wasn't. You come out once, right? I'm not going to come out a second time. But there are good days and bad days. But now I wish I could go into every newsroom or every sort of weekly meeting of investigative journalists in media, go to you know, the faculties where they're studying to explain you could do this so much better by, I don't want to talk about a professionalization of the whistleblower process, because people will always doubt your motives. And I know that my view is that, you know, Frances Haugen, she was very brave, but I hear a lot of quite snide comments that she had PR, she had lawyers, etc. You know, I called the Signals Network an hour before I was revealed as the source of the Uber files. So I think there's a happy medium. You know, when I look at the bravery of people like Maria Ressa, and when we collectively cry for Daphne Caruana Galizia or others who have died, kind of for us, it's their bravery was what they were doing prior to being assassinated, and I think that, you know, I would actually encourage. I'd like to try and help potential whistleblowers in the public sphere, in the private sector, to know that you're not alone. You won't be alone. And just because, you know, okay, give me a microphone, I'll talk. I mean, I'm Irish. I'm not afraid of governments. I'm not afraid of engaging with the media. But that's a minority of people. But there are amazing organizations out there, like the Signals Network and the amazing donor network that allows them to do the great work that they do. And I just think that we need to find a way with ICIJ, with OCCRP, etc., with The Guardian, with Paper Trail and others, Forbidden Stories, to try and, not just a guidebook, to try and make it clear that you're not alone, and for every high-powered, expensive corporate law firm that, you know, the founders of Uber or the board members of Uber are going to pay to try and discredit the whistleblower or undermine that person, or, as happened to me a few days after being revealed, tell their lawyers to tell my lawyers that they're going to sue me for breach of confidentiality, that you've got, who knew that the world of pro bono was so amazing? The lawyers and all of the other people who work in the pro bono sector money cannot buy that expertise, that sincerity, that, you know, companionship. But I think it's still too, you know, the French would say artisanal. It's like a street market compared to the corporate world, which is like Barney's or Harrods. And I think that we need to work at professionalizing a little bit the sort of the landing pad for the women and men out there who want to blow the whistle, and it's an essential component of a functioning democracy. It's like pluralistic journalism, it's like civil disobedience, it's shining a light because corporate corruption is shape-shifting, as I've said.
Thank you, Mark, for willing to work with us to make it happen. We do have a lot of work to do, but we have good people to make it happen, so thank you for helping us. Antoine, you learned also a lot. Yes. What did you learn? What did you wish you would have known back in 2012, back in 2014? What do you say to the whistleblowers or people we're thinking of, and what they should think of?
Actually, any citizen can become a source or a whistleblower, and you don't expect that it can be a life-changing experience. So I think it's the responsibility of journalists to inform their sources that of the potential consequences on the source life. I think that each whistleblower deserves at least a legal counsel about what he's doing to minimize the risk he's taking. When I was facing criminal charges, I hadn't met a lawyer before, and I had no contact, I mean, you feel very lonely, and that underlines the necessity of organizations like the Signals Network to provide at least this legal advice, but it's not only about legal things. In the LuxLeaks case, I had to ask my brother, a cousin, an uncle, to gain some advocacy competencies, to create a website, to gather support of organizations. So I'm very lucky they made a very, very good job, but you can't expect this from anyone. And that's why whistleblowers need a lot of support. I'm sorry to say it, but it's so important.
Yeah, there's the legal need that is most of the time obvious, but there's this psychological support, companionship, as you mentioned, this feeling of loneliness. And that thing, it's so important that whistleblowers can talk to each other because they share this unique journey. There's also, when you decide to come public, we say that actually communication is protection, and how to really make sure, in your case, you have an amazing website, but because you're able to put the facts the way you want the facts to be known for LuxLeaks. So there's a communication component, there's the whole component of speaking to so many parliaments. It's not something you can do alone, and it's good to know you don't do it alone. Frédéric, do you want to add on a few points that Mark, Annika, or Antoine mentioned, and what we have to do to help the future whistleblowers?
An important point where I caught myself in having made mistakes in the past, and that because that's really like treating a whistleblower as a human being, and not only, it's so easy to treat someone as a source, and then you can always argue well, that's professional distance, but going through this process, for example, that a whistleblower has fears, has worries, needs sometimes only time to talk things through, and I think all journalists in this room will realize, I mean, we all know how busy our days are, but I think to find the time to speak with a potential source or with a source of your past, I think that's something that we owe all our sources and what we owe whistleblowers, and I think in reality it's often hard to find this time, and I think that's where I catch myself, this is a duty and a responsibility. I met Antoine today in the morning, and it was the first time after a long time which we hadn't seen each other, despite me being part of the ICIJ team working on the leaked material. So I think that's something we need to do more, and I think we need to speak more about the process of whistleblowers, what goes well, what goes wrong. We as journalists, I think, need to speak more about the mistakes that we have made in the past and what we should change. And I think that's always that's a painful discussion, that's a painful process, but I think we need it because our society needs more whistleblowers. And us as journalists, we also need more whistleblowers because we are a tool of society. So we need to learn how to work better with whistleblowers. I think I heard today the good idea of Antoine to go to journalism schools. Whistleblowers going to journalism schools and telling the journalists of the future what they could do better and learn from all our mistakes.
Yes, thank you, Frédéric. We have very short time to take a few questions from the audience, so I might take, yes, this gentleman here. Please introduce yourself and, of course, ask a short question.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Jakub. I'm a journalist and reporter from the Czech Republic, and together with my colleague Zuzana, who is here next to me, we perhaps broke In recent years, the most famous story involving a whistleblower in the Czech Republic, which is a story of poisoning of Bečva river in northern Moravia. And the critical part of the story is that the authorities went to the great length to divert the attention and the suspicion from a chemical plant that is owned by, at that time, Prime Minister and infamous Czech oligarch Andrej Babiš, and to divert the attention to other company. And we've heard from whistleblowers from inside the plant that there was an accident that happened in the chemical plant of Prime Minister that they managed to keep secret, and due to their information, we were able to break the story. And I don't want to go into details, we don't have time for this. I just needed to explain this context to ask my question, which goes actually to Frederick, who I have great respect to. I have my deepest emotions go to the whistleblowers. We have this experience with working with that man, and I'm extremely proud to say that we have managed to protect his identity. Nobody knows, even if police was trying to find out with quite going to great lengths to try and find out who it is. And my question is about the ethics of protecting the whistleblower while being true to the principles of journalistic profession. Would you, for instance, Frederick, tell things that are not true to protect the identity of whistleblower who can be exposed to danger? Because I don't think we didn't tell any lies, I think, but we tactically conveyed some things that were, let's say, very, very economic with the truth to protect the people involved in breaking the story. So I really would like to hear your reflection on this. Thank you.
We'll take one more short question and then answer, because we need to finish in 3 minutes. So please, very short. Yes. Yeah.
Me?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Tibor Rácz from Hungary, and I'm a former investigative journalist. Now I'm just investigating for a global bank. And we have a very special country in the middle of the European Union, that in that country there was, in my knowledge, there was no whistleblowing in the time of the last 15 years. And what would you recommend how the journalist in Hungary should start to campaign or something like that to get the sources? Because we should have several sources in the country, but we have a special democratic situation in Hungary, so-called.
No, thank you.
So what would be the recommendation?
Okay, and last question from the gentleman in green. Thank you. And then you will have 20 seconds each to answer the whole world.
Well, I think it's a short answer for you guys, but if there was a little time machine and now knowing the outcome of everything, would you do this all again, knowing the emotional roller coaster that comes with it? It's actually a yes or no question, but maybe it's pretty difficult to answer, but that was my question.
Thank you so much. Frederick.
First question. I personally would not lie to protect a question. I would rather not speak to protect a source. But I know the discussion, and it's an ongoing discussion, but I think it's not a good way of like us as journalists lying to protect the source. I think then we should learn to like keep our mouth shut at certain points in times. We don't always have to speak.
Mark, would you do it again?
I would do it again. I mean, nobody wants to be a serial whistleblower, but who knows?
About the question on Hungary, it's very complex, of course, but I hope the EU directive that offered now a better level of protection for whistleblower can be a tool to be used to start a conversation. Antoine, would you do it again?
Yes, and I know very, very few whistleblowers who have real regrets, because it can be very painful to keep to be sorry, when you know some wrongdoings, just keeping this secret, it can be very, very painful, and you feel much better when you talk about it.
Annika, would you do it again?
Absolutely. I would probably be a little more bolder if I did it all over again.
Thank you so much, and let's work.